right now, we've got Tim, Naomi, Ronan, who are going to give papers. Tim Galsworthy is a lecturer currently in history at the University of South Wales, and looking to the long term. Anybody?
Yeah. I'll do anything.
His doctorate, which he's received, is from Sussex, and his research focuses on the relationships between the Republican Party and Civil War memory. Very good stuff. And he's getting married in 2 weeks.
I am. If I told you we're getting married on the 4th of July, can you imagine I'm marrying another historian of the US? So it felt fitting. So thanks, Phil. Hi, everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about part of my research into the Republican Party, Civil War memory, and civil rights during the politically transformative 1960s. I'll be focusing on Black Republicans, a vital intra-party group, highlighting the underappreciated significance of Civil War memory in African-American GOP activism. Just to note, on a couple of occasions, I will be incorporating a term which Black Republicans use to refer to themselves, which is considered outdated in modern parlance. In the period between Richard Nixon's defeat in 1960 and the pivotal 1964 race, the GOP witnessed growing momentum behind racially conservative Southern. No, go back. Go back. I'm going to channel my inner Chris Whitty and say next slide, please. The GOP witnessed growing momentum behind racially conservative Southern Republicanism and the presidential hopes of conservative Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater. The overwhelming majority of Black Republicans implored their party to champion civil rights and complete the unfinished work of emancipation. They relied heavily on what I have termed a Republican emancipationist memory narrative, framing Black liberation as the party's founding principle and primary contemporary concern. Although small in number, Black Republicans were active and generally unified. Lee Wright Rigueur and Joshua Barrington emphasized how Black Republicans, who allied predominantly with the progressive, liberal, Rockefeller wing of the party, proposed a GOP ideology which incorporated civil rights and courted African-American voters. Although both scholars have noted how Black Republicans leaned heavily on the party of Lincoln trope and fought to have the party live up to Lincoln's legacy, they do not fully consider the centrality of historical memory to their activism. Black Republicans use civil memories to participate in internal party battles, attack segregationist Southern campaigns, and delineate pro-civil rights republicanism. Next slide, please. Need a clicker. A prominent Black Republican in the first half of the 1960s was Grant Reynolds, a Florida-born attorney based in White Plains, New York. Reynolds aimed to boost republicanism in urban areas. Visiting cities including Cleveland and St. Louis, he urged local Republicans to stop writing off African Americans. The Civil War informed Reynolds' republicanism deeply. His mother had been enslaved when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, affording him a direct connection with the GOP's liberating heritage. Reynolds highlighted Lincoln's wartime actions and Republican support for Reconstruction when reassuring Black voters that his party was still, or at least should be, the nation's racially progressive party. Reynolds pushed the GOP to honour the Civil War centennial by mobilising Black voters and supporting racial progress, rather than wooing white Southerners. I can think of no period more appropriate for this accomplishment than the 100th anniversary of the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, he declared in January 1963 letters to Republican congressional leaders. Other Black Republicans reiterated Reynolds' pleas for a pro-civil rights GOP. John Calhoun, a prominent Republican and civil rights activist in Atlanta, encouraged his party to take an active interest in the fight against discrimination. The Black businessman, who ironically shared his name with the antebellum South's leading pro-slavery advocate, instructed a June 1962 National Committee meeting in Seattle that firm civil rights stances were the basis for getting the Negro vote back. Championing how Reconstruction-era Republicans started African-American suffrage, Calhoun commanded his party not to sit down and let the Democrats take Black votes away from us. Next slide, please. In the early 1960s, Black and white progressive Republicans were largely united in their intra-party designs and uses of Civil War memory. White progressives, especially Nelson Rockefeller, the standard bearer for Republican liberals, also championed a pro-civil rights GOP aligned with the Black freedom struggle. They similarly used the Civil War centennial as a spur for action, hoping the momentous anniversary, occurring parallel to widespread confrontations with Jim Crow, would convince fellow Republicans that their party must reprise its emancipating role. Black Republicans were, though, firmly conservative on many issues, including welfare, business, the federal government's role in society, which could have engendered friendly relations with Goldwater rights. However, their divergent positions on civil rights, the overriding issue of the day, set Black Republicans and the GOP right on a collision course. Black Republicans presented racially conservative republicanism as a betrayal of the GOP's emancipationist history. They hoped impassioned Civil War memory appeals would rally white Republicans and the wider public to join their fight against the party's transformation. Next slide, please. When 1964 rolled around, Black Republicans placed themselves in the vanguard of the vocal, yet ultimately unsuccessful, Stop Goldwater movement. African-American partisans were alienated and angered by the Senator's vote against the 1964 Civil Rights Act, a landmark Civil Rights Act. His pandering to white racial conservatives, especially below the Mason-Dixon line, and the extremist voters Goldwater was bringing into the GOP coalition. Think the John Birch Society. He was also endorsed by Klan leaders in a few states. Black progressives repeatedly and passionately chastised Goldwater as a deviation from the party's Lincolnian emancipation's history. During the Republican National Convention in San Francisco, protesters carried placards reading, "Goldwater for president, Jefferson Davis for vice president." In an emotive open letter, Black Republican L.J. Jackson accused Goldwater of trying to turn the clock of human progress back 100 years and say to the civilized world that Lincoln was wrong and Jefferson Davis was right. Jackson presented Goldwater as an ally of Robert E. Lee and the Ku Klux Klan, rather than GOP luminaries like Lincoln, Ulysses Grant, and Thaddeus Stevens. Black delegates suffered severe mistreatment during the 1964 RNC, including racist insults and one delegate having his jacket set alight, which led Jackie Robinson to compare being an African American in Goldwater's party to be, quote, a Jew in Hitler's Germany. Black Republicans were inspired to undertake collective action. Under the name Negro Republican Organization, Black delegates pledged to defeat that minority segment who were attempting to make the party of Lincoln a machine for dispensing discord and racial conflict. Black Republicans met in Philadelphia in August 1964 to formalize a more permanent body, the National Negro Republican Assembly, or NNRA. George Fleming, the group's first president, delivered a fiery keynote address denouncing the Republican right. "We have looked upon the face of the enemy within. We have taken his measure, and we have understood the danger to the party of Abraham Lincoln," he declared. The NNRA was an important conduit for Black Republican activism during and immediately after the 1964 election. The group endorsed and supported progressive candidates. It also lobbied party leaders to court Black voters, be strong on civil rights, and provide roles for Black Republicans within the GOP hierarchy. Following Goldwater's crushing defeat in 1964, for those of you who don't know, he lost every state except a few in the Deep South, Arizona. Johnson got 61% of the vote, which was the highest by a presidential candidate at that point. Following that election, Black Republicans were increasingly forthright in their intra-party assertions. They operated with a degree of increased leverage, as some GOP leaders looked to repair relations with African-American voters, including new party chairman Ray Bliss, who appointed Clarence Towns, an African-American insurance executive from Richmond, as his special assistant in April 1966. Towns was charged with overhauling the GOP's unfavorable image among Black Americans. And although the overwhelming majority of African Americans identified as Democrats, only 6% had voted for Goldwater, the small remaining band of Black Republicans was determined to instill its own version of pro-civil rights republicanism. Black Republicans utilized civil war memories extensively in their efforts to foster a racially liberal post-Goldwater GOP, expressing authentic connections with the party's 19th century traditions in fervent appeals. They aimed to overturn the racial conservatism predominating in the early 1960s GOP. However, the 1964 election transformed the relationship which leading Black Republicans had with civil war memory. Unlike white progressives who continued to employ conventional Republican emancipationist memories, some black partisans argued that uncritically celebrating Lincoln or touting the GOP as the party of emancipation was no longer sufficient to justify black allegiance. Following Goldwater's beating, white moderates and progressives deployed routine references to the GOP's origins to legitimize a return to normalcy. This, I believe, is the proper time to remind ourselves in the country that we are the party of Lincoln, asserted Dwight Eisenhower in November 1964, with Henry Cabot Lodge concurring that the Republican Party has got to get back to being the party of Abraham Lincoln, and very quickly. Despite the scale of Goldwater's internal triumph and general election defeat, most white progressives had not reflected critically on their use of civil amendments. But, following the painful shock of Goldwater's campaign, leading black GOP activists no longer believed this self-serving, celebratory narrative was enough to restore their party in African-American eyes. In the first part of the decade, Grant Reynolds had often hailed the GOP's Lincoln emancipationist history as he championed progressive republicanism. Following Goldwater's ascendancy, he was less willing to employ such laudatory references. In a speech at Oberlin College on the 12th of February 1965, Lincoln's birthday, Reynolds delivered a blistering attack on the GOP leadership for their glacial progress in addressing the party's anti-civil rights image. He criticised how Republican orators used Lincoln Day, a prominent date in the GOP calendar, to celebrate the birth of Lincoln by blaming all the ills that beset the nation on the Democrats. Very few, he bemoaned, will seize upon this as an opportunity to acknowledge our party's mistakes, arguing that Lincoln worship was a barrier of self-scrutiny. Today, the Republican Party is faced with whether or not to emancipate itself from outmoded political dogmas, racial exclusiveness, and from an image that makes it attractive to an assortment of right-wing scum, Reynolds told his Ohio audience, betraying anger at those extremists Goldwater had attracted. In other words, he asserted, as Lincoln was confronted with what to do about Negroes 100 years ago, Lincoln's party faces the same dilemma in 1965. Reynolds condemned Lincoln for black military losses during the Civil War. He lamented how in excess of 68,000 black troops were left dead on the battlefields of that ignoble and bloody conflict. Ironically, a characterization of the war which few USCT black veterans would have shared. And thus did Lincoln achieve a greater measure of immorality than any other American leader, Reynolds proclaimed, offering an emotive denunciation of his party's patron saint. And likewise, Clarence Towns engaged in more critical engagement with civil amendment. He argued that Republicans needed to do more than rely on empty Lincolnian illusions if they wanted to convince African Americans that the party had changed. Addressing Ray Bliss's newly constituted Negro Advisory Council in March 1966, Towns condemned how the GOP's attitude to black voters appeared to be, talk if you want to, but come on our terms and remember Lincoln. Lincoln means very little to most Negroes, he suggested, encouraging party leaders to offer hope for the future because black Americans want to forget the hardships of the past. In other speeches, Towns implored Republicans to play the role of the freedom lover, the civil rights supporter, the abolitionists. We cannot continue to ride on Lincoln's coattails in lip service and repudiate him in actions and still expect to win the support of people who are betrayed by such actions, he concluded. These black Republican leaders hoped that declaration would force fellow Republicans to reflect critically on their engagement with civil rights and black voters and their reliance on perfunctory Lincoln illusions. Next slide, please. Growing skepticism surrounding Lincoln's mythologization as a racially enlightened, saint-like figure contributed considerably to the shift in black Republican rhetoric. Throughout the 1960s, Ebony editor LeBron Bennett produced works interrogating Lincoln's racial liberalism, culminating in his February 1968 article, Was Abe Lincoln a White Supremacist? Given the prominence of middle-class African Americans among Ebony's readership, it is probable Reynolds and Towns were aware of Bennett's arguments. And alongside this black radical critique, historian Richard Hofstadter, in the American political tradition, punctured the self-made myth of Lincoln by reclassifying him as an ambitious politician. Some black Republicans implied increased skepticism to their experiences of how Lincoln hagiography was used and abused within their party. And although Reynolds and Towns still saw the GOP as the party of Lincoln and applauded its history, They separated themselves from right Republicans who believed citing Lincoln uncritically was sufficient to re-establish black support. They shared Bennett's conclusion that Americans must stop gazing fixedly at Lincoln. Next slide. Not all black Republicans adopted this increasingly critical version of civil war memory, however. For instance, Edward Brooke, who was elected to the US Senate in 1966 in a landmark race for black republicanism, relied on conventional nods to his party's Lincolnian past as he sought votes in Massachusetts, an overwhelmingly white state. There is so much more I need to talk about today. Black Republicans in 1968, African-American reactions to Nixon, Black Republicans in civil memory at the start of the 20th century, the Republicanism of Colin Powell and Michael Steele, etc. But by way of first brief conclusion, I just want to quickly jump forward to the present. Next slide. The alienation between African Americans and the GOP, fostered in the 1960s, has continued to the present day. Since 1964, no Democratic presidential candidate has received below 80% of the black vote. Those African Americans who remain in the GOP overwhelmingly adjusted to their party's racial conservatism. Black Republicans such as Clarence Towns, Walter Williams, and Tim Scott dismissed affirmative action, race-conscious politics, and authentic Republican emancipationist language. In April 2023, Tim Scott announced his exploratory presidential committee in a slick campaign video shot at Fort Sumter, where the first shots of the Civil War were fired. While referencing the Civil War and suggesting that Joe Biden was trying to civilly divide America, the South Carolina senator managed to not use the words slavery or Confederacy at all. African Americans in the GOP today are far from the liberal intra-party actors of the 1960s. Next slide. I look forward to any questions you may have. Hopefully that wasn't too whistle-stop and all made sense. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Tim. We'll come to questions at the end, of course, but we move swiftly on. Naomi Smith. Excuse me, voice is going. Naomi is coming to the end of her PhD at Birkbeck, researching research interests include intersectionality, decolonization, news story selection, and broadcast journalism. A study that she comes to not just from her academic background, but also her experience as a published journalist and writer, having already completed an MA in investigative reporting at Birkbeck, and is going to talk about the quest for racial diversity in the American news media.
Thank you. Right. So by way of an introduction, this presentation, and I apologize to anyone who already saw this at the annual BAS conference this year. It hasn't changed very much, so hopefully none of you were in that panel. This is essentially a version of the introduction to my thesis that sort of lays out, it tells a story about a particular period of history in the American news media, and sort of lays out part of the reasoning for my research. So if it doesn't make sense, so in 1965, a man called Primo, who fella in the middle here, with his news team. In 1965, he was an up-and-coming news director in Philadelphia, and he rolled out America's first episode of what was called Eyewitness News, which at the time was a new kind of local television news that arguably, or at least the argument I make, changed the way that Americans received the day's headlines and even the substance of the news itself. Prior to the development of Eyewitness, local news was often dominated by national stories, delivered by a rather staid white man in a suit, sitting by himself in a studio and reading from a script. As you can see, I've used Walter Cronkite as an example here. Apologies to Cronkite, who is wonderful. But he does rather, in this image, exemplify that particular type of newsreader. So what Primo did was he brought in a number of changes that might seem quite obvious to us today, but at the time were perceived as quite radical, creating a successful new format for news broadcasts that would eventually spread to major markets in over 200 cities across the USA. Today, I'm going to look at the impact of this new format on communities of colour in particular, the continuing implications, if there are any, for racial diversity in the US and in the news media, and the depiction of marginalised communities in in American broadcast journalism, and whether the subsequent drive towards newsroom diversity has actually resulted in any real lasting change. Next slide, please. Primo, who you can see here again, who died in September of last year at the age of 89. Rather disturbingly, most of the people I'm going to talk about died last year. Was a young 20-something news director, as I said, local television station in Philadelphia, which was his hometown when he had the idea of Eyewitness News, which at first broadcast as a half-an-hour afternoon program beginning in 1965. There were a number of key innovations that define the Eyewitness News formula, among them that instead of the typical white man in the suit, the broadcast was anchored by a man and a woman who would banter about the day's events. Primo created the anchor team of Tom Snyder and Marcia Rose Shestack, who you saw on the previous slide, who became one of the first women to anchor a primetime local news broadcast in a major market. And he also hired a lady called Sue Haynes to become Philadelphia's first Black television reporter, and I'll come back to her later. Primo also sent reporters out into the field, which wasn't usual at the time, and gave them beats such as crime and courts, arts, business, politics, etc. A tactic that was then mostly reserved for newspapers. After completing a report, they'd often join the anchors in the studio and engage in an on-air discussion about their stories with the anchors. Again, this was not normal at the time. Primo wanted to highlight their personalities and draw attention to the role of reporters as eyewitnesses to the stories on which they reported, and to make his news team seem like kind of on-air families who his audience could relate to and would want to watch. Before this, local television reporters had rarely been seen on air or in the studio because stations were reluctant to pay the talent fees, which were higher than the typical salary for a reporter. So on-air talent was typically limited to an anchorman, a sportsman, and a weatherman, and emphasis on man. Primo, however, had a look at the reporters' contracts and the union rules by which they were partially governed, and found that there was nothing that would actually prevent stations from using journalists on air with no additional payments over and above their existing salaries, as long as they were reading copy that they'd written themselves, because they were still acting as reporters rather than talent. This way of doing local news grew audiences and made anchors stars, because it's all about the money. That's what it always comes down to. And over the following few decades, Primo spread this format to dozens of television news stations around the country, as I said earlier, planting an idea that a relatable and diverse group of broadcast journalists could create a winning team and generate high ratings. Again, it's all about the money. More high ratings, more sponsorship money, more advertising. So as the local television news ratings soared, Philadelphia began to see thousands of white residents leaving the city centre for more suburban locales, which were often seen in newscast commercials as images of white families in tidy subdivisions and spacious homes broke up dispatches that frequently cast the city and black residents in a negative light. Crime had become a central element of most local news broadcasts because it was cheap and easy to cover. Again, always comes back to the money. Whereas many other types of story took time, hard work, and significant financial investment. Those stories, crime stories, typically came from neighborhoods where poverty and decades of failed social policies had led to high rates of crime and population loss. And Primo's format did little to encourage reporters to do any follow-up reporting on root causes of violence or documenting the good things that were also happening in those neighborhoods. And by 1987, violence and crime had become the center of Primo's formula. By 1990, 40% of all stories about violence and crime came from stations that Primo had either worked with or consulted for on developing a formula for their use. And the stations that hired him covered crime 5 times more than those that didn't. Even as local and national stations accused each other of sensationalizing coverage of racial disturbances, as they called them, these news formats that undervalued depth and privileged drama, otherwise known as infotainment, continued to spread, and there was little incentive for the networks to course correct. The format's shallow coverage fed into and perpetuated the notion that Philadelphia's troubles were endemic and unsolvable. And while revenue and rating climbed at the networks, they failed to fully explain the issues, growing poverty, police brutality, and the exodus of industry in short entertainment news bites. The coverage of predominantly white suburban areas, however, was very different. It offered a much more balanced view of what it meant to be white, where Black communities and audiences were afforded no such nuance. And multiple studies have indicated that local news had a crime problem, and that it was drawn along racial lines, and that this focus on violence and crime influenced approaches to policing and incarceration, and were likely to be responsible for the persistent belief that people of color committed more street crime than white folks, despite a clear lack of statistical proof. Crime stories that disproportionately represented Black folks as perpetrators and victims of crime had a negative impact on perceptions of the community. But Primo continued to believe that his format offered a public good, a newsroom that looked more like local communities in America. So he began meeting with civic leaders in Philadelphia to discuss the issues with the station's coverage, and through a series of monthly meetings came to believe that there was a need to diversify the newsroom, which was still dominated by white men. Despite pushback from others at the network, Primo decided to hire Trudy Haynes, who you can see here, who had already made history as the first Black weather person in Detroit. Haynes, who died in June of last year, at the age of 95, was born Gertrude Daniels, but was affectionately known to many as Miss Trudy. Prior to her time in television, Haynes began her career as an advertisement model and was the first African-American poster model for Lucky Strike cigarettes. Spent 7 years at a radio station in Michigan, where she started as a receptionist and worked her way up to become editor of the daily program for women. When she was first hired as Eyewitness News, she found that there was very little coverage of the Black community at the network, and that when Black folks did make the news, as I said, it was typically negative coverage centering around accidents and murders. According to Haynes, the newsroom didn't set out to look for those stories, but when they did find them, when they did break, she was often assigned to cover them. And it became obvious to her that the station needed more journalists of color to cover non-white communities in depth. By 1967, anger over racist policing and inequity was exploding all over the country, and protests were held in over 160 American towns. In response, President Lyndon B. Johnson ordered the creation of a task force to examine what had led to this point and how it might be remedied. This was the National Advisory Committee on Civil Disorders. The committee devoted an entire chapter of its report to the media's role in the arrest, and determined that while television networks and newspapers had, and I quote, made a real effort to integrate Black leaders into their coverage of the civil rights movement and report fairly, they'd missed the mark when covering the racial uprisings, exaggerating violence and failing to accurately capture the tone of events. Anyone who's seen the coverage of Black Lives Matter in 2020 will find this eerily familiar. The committee argued that the media had failed to report on the specific causes of the uprisings, and that white Americans were being conditioned by newspapers and television news to understand and expect a false image of Black society in the US that was without proper societal context. So, to try and do something about this, Black folks and other people of color were subsequently hired by newsrooms across America, and pioneers like Trudy Haynes took on and continued to take on personal responsibility for representing their communities with balance and fairness. And recent research has shown that this has been effective to a certain degree. American television newsrooms have grown more diverse over the last 3 decades in respect to both race and gender identity. However, an increase in diversity in newsrooms doesn't necessarily conform to an increase in the diversity of news coverage, nor does it necessarily ensure that the framing of such coverage is unbiased and free of negative stereotypes and marginalized folks. Not only does mere inclusion not necessarily guarantee accurate, meaningful representation, and vice versa, It also doesn't mandate that such inclusion and representation will be intersectional. And that's what my sort of larger research project looks to try and investigate and possibly measure. Many diversity initiatives are somewhat myopic and might therefore, this is my argument anyway, risk replicating certain oppressive structures even while functioning to combat, to a certain degree, others. For example, an initiative that recruits Black journalists might increase representation of Black folks in the newsroom, but only those who are gender privileged, so Black cisgender men, for example, and or class privileged, so upper and middle class Black folks. If it doesn't include intersectionality in curriculum practices. Next slide. Finally, the financial drive to push, and I'm almost done, I promise, to push sensationalist coverage and conflict, not just the subjects that are reported on, but the way they're reported, often by arguments between panelists in the studio, as you can see here. This is sort of panel discussions, which are more often people yelling at each other, on a whole variety of channels. So there's CNN, Fox, and NBC. NBC, yeah. So both cable and network news and sort of traditionally left wing and traditionally right wing news. So across the entire spectrum, essentially. This financial drive to push sensationalist coverage and themes of conflict remains, especially with the advent of cable news and 24-hour coverage, not to mention organizations like Fox News, which deliberately push these narratives to play to their audience base and keep partisan viewers hooked on their content. Moreover, my argument is that asking folks of color to take on the task of rectifying the coverage of their communities often requires a great deal of mental and emotional labor. And many folks of color have found that getting a foot into the doorway is often not enough. They're still required to tailor their coverage to a white editorial producer and a white audience, and typically a male one. This year, and like last month, is the first time in American history when all of the major news organizations have been led by a woman. That's never happened before in American history. Four of them. So inserting people of color into a system built on inherently white supremacist values, as we can argue that most newsrooms originally were in the US. Based on inherently white supremacist values, ideals, and ways of working, doesn't necessarily change that system in any fundamental way. Just changes the demographics of the people existing and working within that system. And they might not be able to operate within that system without adapting their ways of thinking and working to fit its established norms, therefore potentially reinforcing the very ideas they were brought in to challenge in the first place. Real change doesn't necessarily take place until that change happens on a systemic level, until the system itself undergoes change. Inclusion and representation are incredibly important, but in many cases it's likely that they're just one piece of a puzzle. Final slide, please. And I'm just going to leave you with this quote, which I think is quite illustrative, from a recent interview with the Columbia Journalism Review, where Dr. Lecter Preston, who is the current director of Inclusion and Audience Growth and Press Institute, said this: "My last newsroom job, and it's important that he is a Black man. At my last newsroom job as a police and court supporter in upstate New York, a Black pastor came up to me one day and said, to paraphrase, 'You're racist.' At first it was like, 'What do you mean? I'm the only Black person in the newsroom.' But he was critiquing my coverage, and he was right, because my work was perpetuating stereotypes about African Americans on a regular basis. For instance, some of the only coverage of communities of color was covering crime." And this was this year he said this. It's not enough for me to be African American in the newsroom. Systemic issues like training, mentorship, community engagement, and trust building all contribute to poor and unfair coverage. So in other words, very little has changed. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Naomi. And we move briskly on to Roland Mainprize, who is at the University of Warwick, where he's completing his PhD and also acting as associate tutor and researching the CIA and US foreign policy during Lyndon Johnson's presidency. And he's going to tell us about William Raymond at the CIA, and you may say, who? But he's going to tell us.
Okay, so thank you very much for having me here today. It's lovely to be the closing act on what's been a very interesting and engaging set of conversations. I enjoyed it. But I'm here today to talk to you about William Raborn, and specifically William Raborn's time as Director of Central Intelligence whilst at the CIA. Please. So many of you, as I just said, have probably never heard of William Raborn. Unless you're an intelligence scholar, unless you have a big interest in CIA history, William Raborn is probably a name you've never heard of. And there's good reason for that. There's no biography about him, he didn't write an autobiography, there's no journal article about him, and in bigger picture CIA histories, broader CIA histories, he only appears in sort of small passages at a glance. And there's good reason for this. He was only in charge of the CIA for 1 year, between mid-1965 and mid-1966. And as I said, there's not a lot written about him. And overall, I would say that there's a limited understanding of his time at the CIA. But I would also argue that he was a very important DCI at a very important time for US foreign policy in that mid-1965 to mid-1966 period. This was a time when the US were escalating the war in Vietnam. They had the Dominican intervention as well. And overall, that year in charge, I would say, had lasting changes on the CIA for the rest of the Johnson era and perhaps longer as well. So this paper draws on archival material from the Lyndon Johnson Library in Austin, Texas, material from the Library of Congress, online archives, and then also oral histories and memoirs, which are very important when researching an intelligence agency. And what the findings show, and what my argument is that Raborn is mostly considered to be a failure at the CIA because he failed to assimilate the CIA culture during the mid-1960s. And he also oversaw quite intense politicization and the acceleration of presidential neglect by Lyndon Johnson. Okay, so firstly, to understand William Raborn, you perhaps have to look to the man that came before him, which was John McCone. Now, John McCone left the CIA because he was very frustrated, and he was very frustrated with Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson wouldn't read CIA reports, he wouldn't meet with the Director of Central Intelligence, and overall, Johnson had pretty bluntly, he had a very poor relationship with the CIA and a poor opinion of the CIA and its intelligence. And FaceTime was in fact so limited between McCone and Johnson that George Bundy, who was Johnson's first national security advisor, suggested in this memo here that the president go play golf with the DCI. Okay, you're not going to discuss foreign policy, you're not going to discuss intelligence, but go for a few rounds of golf with him and you might show him up, you might be happy. But the golf didn't work. And John McCone actually offered his resignation before the 1960 election. He was asked to stay on for mostly political reasons until mid-1965. And then William Raborn was asked to join the CIA. Now, why was, well, firstly, Raborn was a career naval officer. He'd seen quite big success with developing the Polaris missile system. He had quite big success with this. He delivered it on time and under budget. He was seen as a really effective manager, somebody who could get a job done. But crucially, he had no intelligence experience. So why was he chosen? Well, there was loyalty to Lyndon Johnson. He was quite close friends with Johnson. He was a fellow Texan. He also, as I said, had skills as a manager. Johnson thought he could be a fixer in Congress. And also, perhaps he was used, or Johnson thought he could be used to curb the CIA influence, the influence of the CIA during that time. But many were surprised that the man on the right there wasn't chosen instead. That man is Richard Helms. Helms had been in American intelligence since the days of the OSS during the Second World War. He'd been in CIA since 1947. Phone calls from Johnson to Raborn showed that Johnson did consider Helms, but he wasn't sure about him. So when Johnson was calling Raborn, he said, well, I only need you for around 6 months to a year, and then we'll kick you out. And if Helms is good enough, Helms will replace you, which is very interesting why he didn't just go and pick Helms in the first place when many people thought he was, even at that time, the best man for the job. So anyway, William Raborn accepted the offer. He was, as I said, loyal to Johnson, even though he had admitted himself in the phone call, I didn't have any intelligence experience. He said, I'll do it for you. And in the middle there was a great letter, or a draft of a letter, that was sent from Johnson to Raborn for a few months in charge. He's encouraging him. He's saying, you're the man for the job. I believe you have the abilities, and I know you're not a man to rest on your laurels. But then later on, he says, we don't have many laurels in the intelligence field, which I think tells you everything you need to know about Lyndon Johnson's opinions of the CIA. That letter was actually redrafted in his archives. You can see a more diplomatic version of that particular letter. Next slide, please. So Raborn actually started, or couldn't have asked for a more difficult start as Director of Central Intelligence. This was, as he was being sworn into office, it was the time when the Dominican Civil War was just boiling up. And within days, if not hours of him being in charge of the CIA, the US launched their own intervention by sending Marines to the island. Now, this was a real crisis. The US hadn't at least overtly intervened in the Caribbean for many decades. It was overturning quite a lot of foreign policy precedent. So this moment would have been quite tough for anybody, never mind Raborn, who had no intelligence experience. And in many ways, Lyndon Johnson needed political cover for what he was about to do by sending Marines to the island. There were fears over this being another Cuba, fears about communist state in charge of the Dominican Republic. So Johnson needed political cover. And he thought, well, I can use the CIA for this. Well, the CIA's intelligence was generally quite poor in the Dominican Republic. They haven't accurately predicted the outbreak of the crisis. And as the confusion of the Civil War was breaking out, they didn't really have a good grasp on who was involved and what was going on. But William Raborn said, yes, I will help you. I will find the information you need. And he handed a list of names to Johnson with around 50 suspected communists who were actively involved in overthrowing the president of the Dominican Republic. Now, of those 50 names, some of them weren't even in the Dominican Republic. Some of them were ill and therefore not fit enough to overthrow government at that particular time. Some of the names were actually duplicates, were repeated several times. And most shockingly, some of them had actually been dead for several years. But nevertheless, they were included on this intelligence report. Now, this obviously isn't all Raborn's fault. As I said, he'd been at the CIA for several hours. And Lyndon Johnson likely would have just launched the invasion, the intervention anyway. But it does show a precedent, which carries on for the rest of the Raborn era, of politicization of intelligence. Now, one good thing did come of the crisis. Raborn set up the Operations Center, which was staffed 24/7 and provided the White House with information during crises and real-time information, which came in handy later on in things like the Vietnam War and also the Six-Day War as well. And as I said, this was a sign of things to come. And apparently Lyndon Johnson had already lost confidence in Raborn to produce actual accurate information for the White House. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as I said, well, Raborn's troubles didn't just stop at the Dominican Republic, and his troubles would continue. And as I said in that opening, one of his big failures, or his perceived failures, is his failure to assimilate to CIA culture and to fit in with the CIA during the mid-60s period. Now, what was CIA culture in the mid-60s? Well, it was mostly full of Ivy League educated people. People described them elsewhere as East Coast liberal elite, if you'd like to use that term. There were many career intelligence officers like Richard Helms, who'd been there for several decades. People who were very worldly, people who had a good grasp of foreign affairs and foreign policy, and people who saw themselves as being independent somewhat from the White House. Now, Raborn didn't have any of this. As I said, he was a career naval officer. He had quite a poor grasp on foreign policy and foreign affairs, and he had little understanding of what intelligence actually was, how intelligence was collected, how intelligence was analyzed, and so on. Now, there are quite some quite famous gaffes or infamous gaffes about Raborn, which demonstrate his lack of worldliness. A good one, which is probably my favorite, is when he got handed an intelligence report about Kuwait. He got halfway down and said, hang on, what's this word Kuwait mean? Is it an acronym? Which is a particularly good feature to have for an intelligence chief. He also didn't know what the word oligarchy meant on one occasion. And apparently Richard Helms, who was now his deputy, had to go with him to meetings to explain sometimes what words meant, but also what went on at the CIA, how intelligence was collected, analysed, and so on. Now, many in the CIA instantly knew he was a bad fit. And even outside of the CIA, journalists were beginning to suspect that he was a pretty poor director of Central Intelligence, as well as members of Congress and senators too. Next slide, please. And it wasn't just this lack of worldliness that annoyed those within the CIA. Another thing, and perhaps the main thing that annoyed the CIA officials at that time, was Raborn's eagerness to follow LBJ's orders and give what is called intelligence to please. Now, for those of you who have read about Lyndon Johnson, know he's a pretty imposing character. Here he is giving the famous Johnson treatment. He would bend people to his will quite easily. And perhaps from Raborn's time in the military, he believed in hierarchy and the chain of command. And if the president asked him, apparently on several occasions, when the president asked him to go and find some intelligence, he would stand up and say, "Aye, aye, sir," and then walk out of the room and come back with whatever Lyndon Johnson wanted. So the CIA were quite annoyed by this. They saw themselves being dragged more into operations in Vietnam, a conflict which they had doubts about even at an early stage. And often when Lyndon Johnson didn't like the reports, he would just simply ignore them. But unlike John McCone, Raborn wasn't frustrated by this. He thought, that's fine, this is the chain of command, this is how it's done. Importantly, when the US, when Lyndon Johnson's White House began rolling thunder bombing campaign, they didn't consult the CIA or Raborn whatsoever. And Raborn willingly allowed himself to be excluded from foreign policy creation. Lyndon Johnson's famous foreign policy creation group called the Tuesday Lunch, which was a very select group, but was actually where all the policy actually got made. Raborn, during his time in office, was only there once or twice. And you can actually go and check this because Lyndon Johnson's diaries are very detailed. Next slide, please. Now, all of this was very damaging to the morale of the CIA in that mid-60s period. Morale is obviously very important for any institution, never mind an intelligence agency. But Raborn definitely harmed it. There were mass resignations. People asked to be moved away from DC and away from Langley just to get away from him. Ray Klein, who had been at the CIA for several years, moved to Berlin, again, just to get away from him, and to become the chief of station in West Berlin. And people actively began asking for Raborn's removal, saying, "We can't deal with this guy, he's not right." Clark Clifford, who was a long-time Democratic foreign policy advisor, who then became Johnson's Secretary of Defense, began asking that Raborn be removed. And apparently he was openly ridiculed. So overall, what can we conclude? What is the Raborn legacy? Well, there are some positives, as I said. There was that Operation Center set up during the Dominican crisis, which was very important later on. And he did accelerate intelligence collection by technological means, so by satellites. This had been started under McCone, but Raborn did, having had experience being a manager and the missile system, saw the benefits of intelligence collection through reconnaissance satellites. But overall, you would have to say that he was a failure at the CIA. Richard Helms, who then replaced Raborn when Raborn left, was said to have had to rebuild morale. And Raborn left, what I would say was the CIA was unable to question the White House and unable to offer any alternative to the White House. This again was seen very starkly during the Vietnam War and Richard Helms's time with Lyndon Johnson. Helms, who again didn't believe in the Vietnam War and had massive doubts about it, never questioned it, never offered any alternative, because he knew that if they did, they would just be neglected and he wouldn't go to any more meetings. And he even admitted himself that he was just a fact man, just supplying data, and that was it. But also, William Raborn's time at the CIA also harmed public perceptions of the agency. Journalists were beginning to question not only him, but also the CIA. He began the interest in the CIA during that period. And as I said, finally, senators were also very unimpressed with Raborn's time. And there's a great quote here by Senator Aiken, who said, talking about William Raborn, he said that he is not worth the gunpowder needed to blow him up, which I think is a very fitting way and indicative way to conclude this page. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ronan. I don't know. I think you give William Raborn a bit of a bad press there. Those of us who have worked in US elections know that lists of people who are dead, duplicated, or absent could be quite useful on election day. Yes, ladies and gents, we have a few minutes left of this last session of the programme, and three terrifically interesting papers. Questions? Yeah.
Everybody, sorry to hop the floor. First of all, Tim, I'm interested to know, we stopped sort of mid to late 60s. By 1976, Rockefeller being turned over in favour of Dole, even though he'd been vice president for a short while on ticket. Is that seen as the sort of the end of or the beginning of the dominance of conservatism within the Republican Party? Is that the end of the claims to be the party of Abraham Lincoln, at least for a while? Naomi, really interesting. What I'd like to know is that same, so this, again, same sort of era we see the rise of what becomes initially known as the underground press, but certainly non-traditional methods of journalism. Rolling Stone magazine, for example, we see a lot more of Ramparts magazine and other non or more broader. Is that lack of diversity amongst journalists and actually subject matter reflected in that, as well as in the newsrooms that you be quite interested. I am an intelligence scholar. Johnson has a horrid relationship with the CIA from the start right until the finish. They failed to do what he wants, and he turned repeatedly to Jacob in the FBI to do what he wants, which Hoover does, because they're two of them. What I'm interested to know about his rejection of the code, or perhaps Cohen's frustration. How much is that? Perhaps maybe your work as a code. How much is that a legacy of they are the remnants of the Kennedy administration? Because both Cohen and Bundy are both part of that. They're held over, and Johnson sees that as politically expedient, certainly in the '64 election, but not much longer after. And in fact, his paranoia comes to the fore in that he sees, what does he call it, Bobby lovers under every rock and stone within one. Great.
Yeah, I will leave whether Rockefeller being chucked with the ticket is the end of the Liberal Republicans to Matthew. He can deal with the later period, but I would argue that the Conservatives were already dominant in the Republican Party by that period, and Rockefeller himself has moved decidedly to the right. The short answer is whether that means the end of claims with the party of Lincoln. Absolutely not. Everyone in the Republican Party has to make good Lincoln. Even today, I mean, Barry Goldwater uses a very conservative Lincoln. Richard Nixon uses Lincoln for his law and order rhetoric. Trump loves claiming Lincoln. Him and Andrew Jackson seem to be the only two presidents that he thinks are anywhere near as good as him. So everyone uses Lincoln, and it's that sense of Lincoln is everywhere and Lincoln is nowhere. What I would argue perhaps is that the references to Lincoln become less critical. They become very throwaway. They become, oh, we're the party of Lincoln, or we can't be racist because Lincoln, even though Lincoln was a racist, kind of arguments. What I would say is the critics within the Republican Party or operating around the Republican Party do keep this kind of critical Lincoln, saying we're not the party of Lincoln, we need to live up to it. You get that from Colin Powell in the 1990s, talking about relationships between the GOP and black voters, and through today, like the Lincoln Project. Right? They're called the Lincoln Project. Their opening statement talks about how the party of Lincoln's been desecrated. So Lincoln is everywhere. For most Republicans, it's just kind of utilitarian. They know everyone in America knows Lincoln and most people like him. But for those who are willing to do the legwork and be critical, intellectually critical of the Republican Party, Lincoln is still very, very useful in that guise.
Right. Quick answer to your question is I don't know, because I solely look at television news. However, what I will say is that typically my experience so in terms of diversity, media like the Rolling Stone and more independent media tends to, in terms of diversity, it's still not very diverse. It's still mostly dominated by white folks. There are more women, but not necessarily at the sort of making the decisions. So you'll have reporters and correspondents who are women, but not so much into, you know, sub-editors, editors, managing editors. They're going to be men. You know, right up until maybe the 80s, 90s when that starts changing. But it's still an ongoing process. In terms of race, it's going to be predominantly white folks. However, in terms of subject matter, those alt publications, and you can see this in British media as well, and generally across the media today, they tend to be more subject specific in themselves. And so, and there's less drive towards this sort of quick sensationalist reporting, especially with things like Rolling Stone that were doing a lot of long form pieces. So you're less likely to get something on inner city crime, more something like you know, a Hunter S. Thompson article or something like that, covering some thing of interest, or you know, dispatches from Vietnam or something like that. So there's less of this drive towards the sort of sensationalized coverage. So unless a magazine is, you know, something like The Economist or Time, that's doing sort of more everyday news, you're not going to see so much of that. And you're also going to see something that you don't get on air until on television until things like BET, Black Entertainment Television, come along. What you're not going to get on television that you will get in print is nothing that is solely Black owned and run by people and staffed by run by Black people, staffed by Black people, whereas you will get that in print. So it's sort of yes and no. So I suppose I do have an answer to the question, but I can't definitively say that because I've not studied it. I think that covers everything I want to say.
Very good.
That's a good question about sort of the origin of Johnson's dislike for McCone and his dislike for the CIA. I definitely think it does have quite a lot to do with his sort of Kennedy legacy and Kennedy hangover. Obviously, Johnson, for mostly political purposes, said, "I'll keep you all until my own election. I'll carry on the foreign policies of Kennedy until my own election, to keep the same cabinet." But sort of finding Johnson's dislike for the CIA and for McCone is quite difficult to pin down for one reason. He was said, because he says lots of things, but he only says them once and then never repeats them again. So it's hard to know whether he actually believed them. There's definitely dislike the CIA after the Bay of Pigs. He also described what the CIA were doing in the Caribbean as murder incorporated, and said that this had a blowback onto Kennedy, and sort of saying this is because of the assassination of Diem in South Vietnam, attempts on Castro's life. They just got us now. But as I said, the origin is quite hard to pin down why he disliked the CIA, because he also said that they had conspired against him in the 1960 DNC and given Kennedy the nomination over him. And he only said that story once, never repeated it again. So it's like, well, he doesn't believe in it, even though it's interesting that Nixon had his own fears about that. And then there's also, you know, going back to that cultural difference. Obviously, Johnson grew up very poor from the South, and the CIA were mostly more like Kennedy in some ways. So I think his dislike to the CIA has a lot to do with sort of Kennedy and Kennedy's legacy, the hangover from Kennedy.
It's quite odd he supports all the same activities, but under a different person, Jeffrey Hoover, who goes in and sorts out Dominican, who finds, or doesn't actually find, communists within the anti-Vietnam war movement, who's brought in because the CIA and does all the things that he wants to do. But it's obviously a character clash for the whole culture.
Yes, yeah. It's definitely the CIA as an institution, perhaps not what it actually gets. Slides, which is very interesting.
We've got a couple more. Can we steal a few more minutes? Okay. One, and then you.
I'll ask a quick question, Naomi, and it's a moral question. Do you think of Al Primo as a hero, a villain? He seems to be somebody who's trying to make it more diverse. He's maybe changing the way in which news media is done. In some ways, for the better, so male, female role, maybe making it more accessible to ordinary people to watch the news because it's more interesting. There's less of the water complex, as fantastic as water complex is, she's staring down the barrel. There's more, you mentioned banter, and maybe this is making things more accessible to ordinary people. And then, of course, you mentioned the diversity, but then you also mentioned other elements about problematic. So, what are your own moral thoughts on how we
I think it's more nuanced than whether he's a hero or a villain.
And you can say that.
It's so I had a thought and lost it. So it's more nuanced than that because it in part comes down to what you think news should be, in terms of it being a moral good. And it's complicated by the fact that, as I say, it always comes down to the money, both because a television network generally loses money on its news division. This isn't the case for things like CNN and Fox News, where that's arguably what they do, very arguably in terms of Fox. But they typically lose money on it. It's a prestige thing generally, or it's related to keeping their license to broadcast because it's required that you have some kind of news, something that's of public interest. That's not true for cable, but that's true for NBC and CBS, which is why they have that 1 hour of news, or maybe 2 or 3 hours of news. So it kind of comes down to whether you think that what the balance should be, whether it should be, all very sort of fact-based. There shouldn't be any sort of entertainment value because it's news. It should be serious. It should be objective. But then on the other hand, it's balancing that with, well, there's no point unless people watch. And there's no point unless it's successful and it's understood by the widest range of people possible. And so it really comes like he tried to do both of those things, but lent towards maybe too far towards the sort of entertaining people and trying to bring them in. And ultimately, it doesn't really work anyway. It sounds like a great idea, but it's really where we see this sort of descent into infotainment, which ultimately you could argue leads to Roger Ailes and Rupert Murdoch being able to create Fox News in 1996. Thank you. I was like, is it 4 or is it 6? I can never remember. In 1996, and there being a market for that already. And also with MSNBC, they were trying a similar thing, but specifically marketing towards New York liberal elites. They had an espresso machine on their set originally, for example. The idea was you were having coffee with your enlightened academic elite friends. Like, they were very open about that. And so it really comes down to what you think that news should be, and whether you think that the news networks get that balance right. I'm going to take the middle road and say that he had some good ideas, he had some bad ideas. Ultimately, the execution was not great, but it paved the way for what is, inarguably a more diverse news environment. Whether that is better or not, the more commercialized it becomes,
the more you shift towards the sort of entertainment end of things. So it sort of ended up just being different rather than being better.
My first question, thank you once again, the excellent presentation. My first question is to Ronan, is in regards to Raborn's legacy, you mentioned about 3 points of light and street priority. Number one, providing intelligence to police. The second one is politicizing intelligence, and the third is very poor public perception about intelligence community. Do you think in today's CIA, those Raborn's legacy are still there? And if so, what is the reason behind it? And my second question is to Tim. Going back to Lincoln's Republican Party, in today's Republican Party, where does this particular narrative fit, considering Trump's, presidency, so on and so?
Thank you, Greg. An interesting question. I would say, you're sort of saying, does Raborn's legacy still last today? You'd have to say no. I mean, you can't blame him for everything that's ever happened in American intelligence, obviously.
Iran-Contra's his fault.
Yeah,
directly.
Yeah. I think, there's some precedent for them what went on and happened, but I think even if you'd have put somebody else in charge during that era, the same things would have happened. I perhaps didn't explain that enough, that it's not all his personal fault. I do feel some sympathy for him. He took a job that he was not accustomed to. But no, I don't think it's all his fault. I think after the Johnson era, things change again. There's obviously some legacy that carries on, but I think as soon as Johnson leaves, that main sort of legacy is ended by that.
Right.
So it's your question about how do we get from the party of Lincoln to the party of Trump?
Right.
Oh God, that's the contemporary hook for my book. How do we get to and I think the key part. Okay, God, I could speak for an hour about this, but I won't. No, I won't. It's the fact that American political parties from that period through to the present day are not stable bodies. They are massive broad churches that, the entire British political system would basically fit in the Democratic Party today, for instance, just about. And Lincoln's Republican Party is a complete mishmash of out-and-out abolitionists, free soilers, anti-slavery Democrats, union so it doesn't make sense as a political party apart from in that context of the 1850s, 1860s slavery. And how you get from the party to the party of Trump is the party goes through lots of peaks and troughs. It's incredibly progressive on race, it's incredibly bad on Indian policy in the 1870s at the same time. It's killing Native Americans at the same time as giving rights to black men. Okay, so it's doing the same thing at the same time. But essentially what happens really is the Republican Party from the late 19th century into the 20th century largely gets associated with large capitalist interests in the East, business interests. It gets tied up into that money, and that's what it gets tied to. And I think the moment when the Republican Party changes, and I'm not just saying that's my period, is the 1960s. It is this moment when the party changes. It stops being a broad coalition that can encompass people from all over the country, and it does become much more centre-right to far-right in its direction. Like, it isn't going to try and cater for moderates in the same way. Moderates become they're still there, but they're arguing against the dominant strain. And that's part of the Southern strategy. That's the moment you start getting white Southerners into the party, but also because the Southern strategy is not just about getting white Southerners, it's also about getting racially conservative white Northerners. And the minute that you've made the decision as a party that you're going to play on race and racial conservatism and racial angst, you're on the road. And that's why I think that there's a mistake to think Trump is an anomaly. Trump is a byproduct of decades of the Republican Party going to the right, deciding they're going to play on cultural issues rather than the economy. And that's how, as much as Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell want to talk about the economy, that doesn't happen anymore because you're talking about culture. So that's how, because there isn't a straight line. You want to know a book about Helen Cox Richardson, To Make Men Free, because she talks about these peaks and troughs. How in some moments the Republican Party is liberal and is trying to change things. Grant, Eisenhower, she kind of peaks and troughs, but then it really, when it troughs and it veers towards culture. So basically, it's about race, and it all changes in the 60s. And read my book. There you go. That's the conclusion.
Ladies and gents, I want to finish by Thanking a whole load of people. Thanking Rothermere for hosting us and helping financially support this day. Thanking Stamford House. Thanking the British Association for American Studies, all of whom pitched in. Thanking, of course, my own little group, the American Politics Group, who supported this event, and also whose postgraduates and early career member, Laura Smith, actually organised it all. So it's been a great display of expertise and exploration and thankfully wit during the day, and which I've enjoyed immensely. Thank you all for presenting. Thank you in the audience for terrific questions to keep us going. Thank you very much.